some of them, most of them are based on evidence from experimental studies. So the first studies that were performed concentrated on exposing lab animals to certain chemicals and certain substances to see what happened. And some of these substances actually generate CDH in the offspring. That is what we call environment. Now mind you, environment, when geneticists talk about environment, they don't mean the environment. They just mean everything which is not genetic. So everything that adds up to the genetic status of a person. Most of the evidence now points to a genetic theory of CDH development. And this is why we know that some animal breeds, like some breeds of dogs and some breeds of sheep, have a higher prevalence of CDH than other breeds. And also, lab mice that have been engineered with specific gene defects in certain genes have a higher prevalence of CDH in their offspring. These are all elements that from the animal studies point to a genetic origin of CDH. Also, many babies that have chromosome abnormalities also have CDH, but not every chromosome abnormality influences diaphragm development, only some of them. And those are the regions that we are more interested into because we think that those regions harbor genes that regulate diaphragm development. Also, some genetic syndromes are associated with CDH. We'll see in a while what a syndrome is. And also, there are cases of CDH that run in families. This means that in a certain family, there is more than one affected, maybe two siblings, maybe a kid and his uncle may be affected. What is most likely is that DNA and something else which is not DNA interact together to regulate diaphragm development. So what does it mean to be genetic? Genetics studies how traits are inherited across generations via the DNA, so those are things that run in the family, but genetics also studies the effects of DNA on health and disease regardless of a familial thing. And this is what DNA is. So DNA, of course, is the blueprint for making us who we are. That's what many people know. But from the chemical point of view, it's made up of a lot of nucleotides. It's like a string of several nucleotides. Of those 4 kinds, they're called A, G, C, and T. So A is for adenosine, G is for guanosine, C is for cytosine, and T is for thymine. And they line up, and then they coil to form a double helix. But the double helix, it's also tightly packaged into the cell nucleus. So this is just this picture to the left, slightly tilted to the side, and you can see that the double helix coils over itself several times to form that X-shaped structure, which we call the chromosome. So you can see that the architecture of DNA is very complex. So it goes from single nucleotide level to a full-fledged chromosome. When we have to design a genetic study, we have to take into account that we have to use several different experimental technologies to capture the full complexity of DNA structural architecture. So we have to study chromosome level, we have to study the nucleotide level, but we also have to study everything which is in between. So the role of geneticists in CDH studies is quite important because in some kids, not everyone, but some of them, CDH is part of a broader genetic syndrome. And geneticists and genetic counselors are trained to recognize and diagnose specific syndromes. And we are very concerned with the array of genetic syndromes because they are very important as they provide researchers with knowledge of mechanisms and genetic pathways that are at play here. A syndrome is a Greek word that means running together. So basically, when we see that 2 or more signs go frequently together in several patients, we might call that a syndrome, especially if we believe that they have the same cause. And this is what geneticists do in our study and in general. So we have to dig deep into the history of a baby to find out if there is a genetic syndrome there and what genetic syndrome it is. We have to investigate deeply the family history, that is considering siblings, parents, but also grandparents, uncle and aunts, looking for subtle signs of the disease that may be not really apparent. And also we have to look at the personal medical history, maybe reviewing hospital charts and records to find specific disease patterns that might point to a certain genetic syndrome. And we also do a physical exam. Part of it is very similar to what you have seen in pediatric studies, by pediatricians. And some of them are specific to the geneticists, like taking measurements of many parts of the body. So you take measurements of the head, of the torso, of the arms, of the fingers, of the ears, and how the eyes are spaced. And then we compare these measurements to charts and of what is the average measurements in kids of the same age and the same sex. And if it's below that, above that, or even right in the middle, those are all important clues to diagnosing a syndrome. And we also take a close look at the picture, at the face. We may take also pictures, and that is because certain faces and certain characteristics are also very helpful to diagnose a syndrome. And then when we have a list of possible syndromes that we want to test, we can run specific genetic tests. Not every genetic test is good for everyone. And this is just to give you an idea. This is most of the syndromes that have been associated with CDH. Now, I don't want you to read them all, because there are many, but just to give you an idea of how many they are, there are really many. And some of them have their cause at the single nucleotide level, like Simpson-Golodny-Bemel syndrome, and some instances of Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome. Some of them are on the chromosome level, like monosomy 22q11 and trisomy 18. And some of them also have no cause that we know of, like Fryns syndrome. We don't really know what it's caused. Actually, there are several theories and several regions that might be good candidates to generate Fryns syndrome.